Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mrs. G's Story Time. We are reading The Rainbow Garden by Patricia St. John with permission of Moody Publishing Company. And we are reading Chapter 6, The Stranger in the Garden. All Saturday, we tobogganed and snowballed and made a snowman with some of the village children. But by midday, even I, unused to the country, realized that a change was taking place. A warm south wind was blowing, and by the end of the afternoon every tree was dripping, and the grass was showing through the toboggan tracks. The poor snowman was shrinking, and his hat had fallen down over his shoulders. We squelched up to the farm in our Wellington boots, and long before we reached the gate, we could hear the restless cries of the lambs, who were straining to escape to the open meadows. "I'll let 'em out tomorrow," said Mr. Jones, who was sweeping out the barn. "Spring's on the way, and they know it." The children in Caldwaller knew it too, and had seemed to me quite excited all day, rolling noisily about in the snow. Fortunately, they had not tried to push me over, and I just stood around most of the time feeling cold and bored. I was glad to get back to the farm, and the lantern light in the barn. "What happened to the lamb, Mr. Jones?" I asked eagerly. "Come and see," said Mr. Jones kindly, and we squelched through the muddy slosh to the door of the fold. He held up the lantern and pointed to the corner. "See there now," he exclaimed. The ewe was lying on his side as before. Nuzzled against her were 3 lambs, all feeding contentedly together. The biggest of the 3 seemed perfectly at home, and even gave a little shove to the twin who was taking up most of the room. "What happened?" I asked. "Did they stop butting it?" "No," chuckled Mr. Jones, "but she stopped crying and butted back. That settled things." We smiled at each other, and then Peter, Janet, and I went bounding down the hill, hungry as hunters, and the orange lights in the windows shining out to welcome us home. We were left far behind again, but instead of being angry, my thoughts wandered to the sleeping garden. Perhaps even now the snowdrops and the buttercups were pushing up. I decided to go first thing the next morning to investigate. Fortunately, I woke very early, and Janet was fast asleep. I dressed very quickly and then tiptoed downstairs. It was 7 o'clock, 2 hours till breakfast. I paused a moment on the stairs, wondering if Mrs. Owen was awake. I sped on downstairs and slipped through the front door and didn't stop running until I was halfway up the hill. Then I stopped to catch my breath. A big thaw had set in during the night, and the earth was drinking deep. I thought about the roots underground. One day of sunshine and everything will burst out. That was what Mrs. Owens had said. The sun was not yet up, but the sky was brighter and clearer every moment, and the birds were singing joyful messages to each other. The garden, when I slipped over the wall and climbed down my ladder, was still asleep in the shadows, and the snow was piled against the house. But on the lawn it had melted, and the buttercups smiled up at me, and the snowdrops clustered stronger and sturdier than ever. I wandered in, thrilled, and turned around the corner. Then I stood quite still, rooted to the spot, for a man was standing in the little yard gazing at one of the darkened windows. I did not know if I was frightened or just very surprised. He glanced around fugitively and saw me standing there. He gave me a startled jump, but seemed to recover at once. Walking up to me, he said, "Good morning," in quite a pleasant voice. "Is there anyone at home?" he asked rather uncertainly. "I don't think so," I replied. "I think it's an empty house. Either no one lives there, or they've all gone away." He frowned at me fiercely, and at this time I definitely felt frightened. "Then what are you doing here?" he asked severely. I could have asked him the same question, but I didn't think of it. I only minded about one thing, and that was that I should not be turned out of my garden, so I replied as boldly as I could. "Oh, I live just down the hill. I'm allowed to come in. I look after the garden." He looked at me narrowly. "Thought you said you didn't know who lived here," he said after a moment's pause. "Well," I answered, "I don't know who they are because I've only just come to live here, but Mrs. Owen down the hill knows them, and she said I could look after the garden." I didn't know whether Mrs. Owen knew him or not, nor did I care, for no one had taught me the importance of speaking the truth. But once again the man's manner changed, and he spoke pleasantly. "Well, it's a nice garden to look after," he said, looking around. "I'm a bit of a gardener myself. Do you come here every day?" "Oh, no," I answered. "I go to the school every day, and I come here on Saturdays and Sundays." He looked relieved. "Do you mean to tell me," he questioned, "that you see to this garden all alone? Does someone else come in during the week?" I don't think so, I said. I answered innocently, for I did not like the idea of anyone else invading my secret place. But the moment I said it, I wished I hadn't, for it had begun to dawn on me that this man shouldn't be here, and why was he asking all these questions? I did not like him. His face looked ill and haggard and unshaven. His clothes were dirty, and he smelled of drink. Nor did I like the way he kept glancing around out of the corner of his shifty, frightened eyes. I stared at him very hard, and I think he felt uncomfortable, for he suddenly pulled his cap down over his eyes and turned away. Well, he said, if the master's not home, it's no use waiting. I'll call again. So long. So he climbed over the barred gate and was gone. I gave a sigh of relief and turned back to my garden, but somehow the birds were no longer singing as they had sung before. Perhaps they'd just been frightened away by our voices, but it seemed to me as though some dark shadow had fallen across the garden, and for the first time I felt lonely. But not for long. As I stood wondering whether I should run home again, I saw a streak of golden brown, and a squirrel came darting down the trunk of an old chestnut tree in the corner. He sat looking at me from between the roots of the tree, and his bright eyes twinkling. As he twitched his tail, all my loneliness melted away, forgotten. I knew what I wanted to do that morning, and I worked away happily until the sun came up over the hill. I wanted to make a little rockery like those I had seen in the parks. Some day, coming out of school when Janet was busy with her friends, I would slip away unnoticed and buy seeds. Then, when summer came, my rockery would be a mass of color. Birds and bees and butterflies would hum and flutter around it, just like Mrs. Moody's garden in Sussex. So I ran to and fro, banking up the soft earth and collecting stones till it was nearly breakfast time. I noticed a ring of crocuses pushing through the grass. I jumped into it, pretending it was a fairy ring. Here, all by myself, with no one to laugh at me for being such a baby, it seemed easy to believe in such things, even though I was 11. I stood quite still, wondering what to wish for. I know, I said to myself, I'll wish for fullness of joy. And so I wished, and then, suddenly realizing it was time, I went back for breakfast, and I skipped off down the hill. When I got home, I ran upstairs to brush my hair and found Janet kneeling by her bed, saying her prayers. I decided to ask her an important question, since I thought it might stop her from asking where I'd been. Janet, I said as she lifted her head, do you know a lot of verses in the Bible? Oh, yes, nearly all, she answered confidently. Where have you been, Elaine? Because, I went on, taking no notice of her question, there's a special verse, and I know the beginning, and I know the ending, but I don't know the middle. It's like this: in something is fullness of joy. Janet says, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's in heaven is fullness of joy. In fact, I'm sure of it. I think I remember. Now, it's time for breakfast. Come on. She danced away to help carrying the porridge bowls, and I stayed behind, slowly changing my shoes. I was disappointed in Janet's answer, for heaven was far away, and I wasn't sure I'd ever get there. Mrs. Moody had told me that good people went there when they died, but I didn't know if I was good or not, and I'd never thought about it much. I thought I was better than Janet, but I didn't forget things, and I wasn't so noisy and untidy. Yet Janet cared about people in a way I did not. I had not realized that I cared for no one but myself. But I did wonder what made Janet different. I wandered about after school breakfast soon, still thinking about it and still looking down curiously at the unmade bed and open Bible, with a shabby little notebook beside it. What did she see in it? And what did she write down carefully every morning? I stooped down to peek at what she had just copied on her round, clear writing. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God in Christ has forgiven you. And that's Ephesians 4:32. And tomorrow we'll read chapter 7, Through the Open Window. I love you. I'm praying for you. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.